Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seat. We're going to try and get started and keep this on track this morning. I'm Janet Atkins, and I'm the newest member of the Board of Directors of the Olmsted Network. Total pleasure to be here this morning. These children have left, but I'm in total awe of the Newburgh Free Academy. They're working down. And for all of us that care about Olmsted, they are the future. They are our future. And I think we saw their work, their dedication, their commitment to the principles of Olmsted. And I just hope that we will see a number of them carry forward in their commitment to green space here and everywhere else they go. So I come from Boston and Bristol, Maryland, where I live with my wonderful husband, who is as committed as I am, but I was born and raised in Atlanta. So my Olmsted credentials began there, where I watched my mother, her friends, and some that were not friends that she convinced and raised a lot of money from, that they were going to save Piedmont Park, designed by Olmsted's sons. The brothers had this vision, much like they did, their father did, about the democratic principles of bringing rich and poor, all colors, young and old, together in green space. And so in 1989, she and her friends created the Piedmont Conservancy, and in 1992, they created the first public-private partnership, something that she taught me about, that I continued to do on into my days in Boston. I am also was a member for 15 years of the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. I think you all know it was a project that Olmsted did 20 years after Central Park, 1,100 acres. It runs from the Boston Common all the way to Franklin Park, seven miles. It's pretty astonishing. And I also was a founder of the Olmsted Tree Society, and with my adorable friend Margie Grekel, who you will hear from later, we sit on the LIFT committee where we raise capital for ongoing projects in our partnership with the state and with the city of Boston and Brookline. And that work taught me a great deal. And I'm very grateful to Karen Monty-Broddock, who's with us this morning, who's the CEO of the Emerald Necklace Conservancy, and her vision for Boston. This morning it is my pleasure to introduce Sara Zewde, who is a phenomenal voice and talent. She has 3 degrees from BU, from Harvard Graduate School of Design, and finally MIT, where she carried forward for even more learning from their School of Architecture and Design. She lives in New York. Her firm, Studio Zewde, is in the AD 100. It is a phenomenal firm, a voice for the future, and I'm happy to say that she stays connected to Harvard as a professor and to the Hudson Valley. The commission that her firm received to design the South Garden for D.A. Beacon, kudos to you, and of course, the newest commission, which we are very proud of. She has won the first phase of the Franklin Park restoration for Olmsted's Overlook, a project that we think is going to be groundbreaking. And as many of you know, Franklin Park is currently the issue of a suit between the Emerald Necklace Conservancy and concerned citizens and the city of Boston and the mayor for encroachment on a park by the city to use it in a lease with developers and what we think is an encroachment on the basic principles of democracy. Privatization. We try hard to be careful about the audience, but I think all of you will understand. We're looking for the continuation of this, perhaps at the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, so stay tuned. Sara is also a valuable member of the Olmsted Council. She brings her advocacy, her voice. She's an ambassador for our work. And frankly, she and her firm are educating the next generation of folks that we hope will continue the principles that we are all known for and dedication to the legacy of Olmsted. I also want to say that I think in reading about her firm, she really understands the struggle that we all have and will continue to have, this balance around progressive urbanism, balanced with green space, and a commitment to the democratizing principles that we all know were at the kind of baseline of who Frederick Olmsted was. And I believe it is her voice. They are part of the AD 100. It will be she and her studio that represent what I think will be progressive development with a mind's eye to how do we balance it with the needs of all of our people, environmental justice and equity for all citizens. And so she's going to talk to us this morning about a subject that I'm very keen on, and that is Olmsted's journey through the slave South. It is part of her research. It is a book she is working on. I will personally say I'm happy to host her first book signing in Boston or New York. And I'm so delighted to have her with us this morning. So please join me in welcoming Sara Zewde.
I don't even want to present after that introduction, but here I am. Is there a clicker that I can use? Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. I will present about Olmsted in the South, but I'm also going to do a little bit of that and also share a little bit of our recent work in the firm and how it kind of relates to the takeaways that I've been forming from my research around Olmsted. And these are questions about memory in the American Public Art Project. Okay, here we go. How many of you are familiar with Olmsted's time in the South? Okay, actually not that many for most of the crowd. Part of the reason why I'm going to fill some airtime. Part of the reason why I became interested in this, I always tell people, I'm not a historian. While I am a professor, I would not call myself a scholar. I'm a woman who was born in the South and became a landscape architect and grew this curiosity about the relationship between Olmsted's time in the South and his practice of landscape architecture. What was the impact of that on the field that I practiced in? I grew up on the Gulf Coast in Louisiana, Texas, and in fact there was this storm event that prompted me to become a landscape architect and figuring out the ways in which ecology and politics and design come together to manifest a hurricane Katrina, and what is the professional skill set that could allow me to project into those values. And so I practice, I research, I teach, and as you'll see over the course of the presentation, those activities for me are not distinct, but they really inform each other. And as was mentioned, I have a practice based in Harlem, New York. And so the collection of people that contribute to this work every day. Our practice is really set up as a very collaborative space where many ways of thinking about landscape architecture are kind of brought together. I really, am into the idea of expanding the inputs into landscape architecture in order to continue to evolve the field itself. So community engagement is a big part of what we do, and then ultimately bringing that into the craft of building landscapes. So I'll start talking a little bit about my research about Olmsted in the South. In 1852, he was commissioned by the New York Daily Times, which is now the New York Times, to travel to slave states and write about the conditions of slavery. He was writing contemporaneously, and part of one of the big takeaways for me in this research is how central his experiences in the South were, how formational they were to what would become his practice of landscape architecture. I think broadly how we understand his history is, it's often characterized as he was a journalist and an advocate before, and then he, stumbled onto practicing landscape architecture, and that those were distinct chapters of his life. So here is a timeline graphic kind of showing some of the key moments of his work as a journalist, largely writing about slavery. And here are the key moments of his biography as they relate to the history of his practice of landscape architecture. But if we look at them across time, they are not distinct chapters. In fact, he's going back and forth between these activities, and they are part of the same project for him. And here are some, key historical moments in that context that he's referencing in his writing and in his letters that are helping to shape his practice and thinking. And that, if we look towards the bottom, 1860 to 61 is kind of a key moment here. Lincoln is elected in 1860, and shortly thereafter he actually steps down from his position as superintendent of Central Park to come back to his writings for the New York Times and write a singular volume called, in a more staunchly abolitionist voice, called The Cotton Kingdom. And he does so partly because he sees that the country is headed towards a civil war, and he wants to publish this prior to that, and in fact he does, about 6 weeks before the first shots fired at Fort Sumter. This is all, while construction is happening at Central Park. This is a drawing that he made together with a man named Daniel Goodloe, an abolitionist from North Carolina, for the Cotton Kingdom publishing. This is a technique that we might generally perceive to be more modern, more contemporary, but he was doing spatial analysis in 1860. This is census data, and this is basically a graphic that summarizes a key argument of the book, which is he's challenging the economic argument for slavery, that actually where there are larger concentrations of enslaved people, the economy is not faring as well. And while it is producing a few very rich people, the economy itself isn't doing well. And he points to things like a dearth of public space, a dearth of public education, public health care. The idea of publicness itself is corroded by slavery. That its effects on the enslaved are clear, but its effects on the enslavers is less documented. And he starts to point to the idea that when you see people as be they black, what have you, as not human, you start to also see each other as not as human. And so, he points to that as having a corrosive effect on the very idea of democracy. And these aren't new ideas, and this is a quote from Charlie Beveridge that, actually characterizes slavery as foundational in Olmsted's thinking about public space and landscape architecture. And so I spent time with support from Dunbar and Oaks, and the Graham Foundation, going through his letters and actually retracing his steps to the South. So I largely followed the Seaboard Slave States itinerary and visited those places. And I'll just share a few images with you from across my journey. This is actually, Olmsted visited a lot of African burial grounds. This was actually a big part of his travels. This was one in Richmond that I went to, and when I figured out where it was and I went, and Olmsted actually describes this really moving ritual burial, and he's describing a topography and landscape that I couldn't figure out because this is what I've seen. And I realized I was actually there, that this is what it looks like today, and that there are thousands of bodies below us there. One of the biggest takeaways for me was that it's an ironic twist of fate. This is actually another burial ground. I visited this one's in Savannah, Georgia. In an odd twist of fate, the very profession that we can say he potentially founded, I know that's up for debate, has been used as a tool for obscuring the stories that he wanted to tell about the landscape. This is another African burial ground, and there are bodies that lay here, but it's a park. And most of the people in the park, I spent a day just sitting there, don't know. They all know Frederick Olmsted, and they were so excited to, when I would talk to people and say, what I'm doing there, oh, Central Park, and they had no idea that he came to this place, and he transcribed word for word what was written on the headstones of the people buried in this African burial ground. Those headstones are not there. That's been erased, and there's been, ironically, a park put in its place. And so landscape architecture is actually complicit in erasing the stories that Olmsted dedicated his time to document. I actually found those headstones that Olmsted transcribed only because he gave me word-for-word descriptions of what was there in another part of town, below a layer of dirt. And so the question for me as a practicing landscape architect is, can the tools of landscape architecture actually give rise to the presence of history? Or, do we just kind of put one specific vision of what landscapes look like everywhere? Or can this actual skill set be used to amplify history and reaffirm identities in the landscape? And still hold true to, what it is that Olmsted proffered as what is important about democracy and its relationship to public space, the role that public space plays in strengthening civic society. I always get the Seneca Village question, so I'm just going to preempt that. The selection of, Olmsted says there couldn't have been a worse 840 acres for Central Park than where it was. He was on the East River side of the debate. He never, I've asked every Olmsted scholar I can find, nobody can find reference of Olmsted actually saying the words Seneca Village. But he writes emphatically, in fact, he closes out his series for the New York Times writing emphatically about fair play for the Negro, and that the success of Black people in the North specifically is the measure of democracy. And so one can only start to triangulate between his arguments about fair play for the Negro, his critique of the location, and he's actually pretty frustrated by the political corruption that led to the siting of Central Park where it was. So the selection and the removal of people predates Olmsted's involvement in Central Park. It does offer the legal precedent for what we would see over the next 165 years, which is parks seemingly benevolent but being used to remove people across the United States. This is Tanner Spring in Central Park, which was a feature that was central to the lifeways of Seneca Village. And so the Central Park Conservancy has been doing work, and I've been kind of in continued conversation with them about this, about ways in which to highlight something like this, something that's existing in the landscape, but tells the story, helps us imagine the incredible kind of everyday life of an entire community that lived here. And so we're thinking about ways around sound specifically as a way to help prompt the imagination and knowledge around the history of Seneca Village. Frederick Olmsted and Malcolm X on the same slide, you probably are like, what is the connection here? But Malcolm X actually cites Frederick Olmsted in his autobiography as he read Cotton Kingdom while he was in prison. And it actually, he cites it as what gave grounding to his understanding of the condition of enslaved people in the United States. So you might even say that without Frederick Olmsted, we wouldn't have had Malcolm X. So again, the question now is, well, what can landscape architecture, what do we do? How do we do this? So I just pulled together, what time do I have until 10:55, I think? Okay. 3 projects that we're doing in the office that I think could offer some ideas about how do we do this all. We're doing a project with Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which is between Cleveland and Akron. And the context of this is national parks are at a crossroads. The creation of national parks obviously, well, maybe not obviously, separated Native people from their land. And at the same moment, it was embedded with the thinking of an Olmsted who writes the Assembly Report in 1865 with some abolitionist ideas. But the removal of Native people and the obscuring of a lot of history, including Black history, in those national parks, correlates to the fact that the visitorship and the staff of the national parks are largely white. And, oh my God. Not me. I think I know what slide is next, so I can talk about it. We have the creation of the national parks in 1872, officially, and it wasn't until the Nixon administration that there was a really concerted effort to bring national parks to urban areas. And that is in the context of urban unrest in the 1960s. Sorry, guys, close your eyes. Don't look. Okay, let's see, all right. All right, I'm gonna skip through all of this. This is what leads to the creation of Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Through a lot of activism in the 2000s, up until the 2000s, which formally is designated a national park. But so we got this commission about a year and a half ago, and the superintendent of the park, as well as the director of conservancy, really wanted to grapple with this. They wanted to grapple with diversifying the visitorship of the park, and also engaging in indigenous landscapes and the Black history of the park. Oh my God, it's doing it again. Wow, oh, I see that. I can talk really fast. Just talk. All right. What's the next part? Let's see. So the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, they purchased, it's a 33,000 acre park, and they purchased 200 additional acres. They purchased a former golf course, and they commissioned us to design these 200 acres relative to these aims. And what we did was sorry guys. Okay. Oh, okay. I don't. Maybe it's about a third through. Yep, that works. If you can actually move forward a little bit. Okay, yeah, perfect. They purchased 200 acres of former golf course and hired us to develop a plan for this property relative to these aims. If you go to the next slide. This was our consultant team. We worked with a civil engineer and an ecological consultant. And our first step into the project was conducting a historical analysis of the site. Next slide. Starting with the indigenous legacy of this land. And so this is a drawing of the mounds as they relate, the native mounds as they relate to the river. And what you can tell from this is their siting along the river really made clear that the river and its water were central to the lifeways of native people, or is central. Over the course of the 19th century, you see the emergence of industry, the presence of the Underground Railroad here on Olmsted. And the early 20th century, the Ku Klux Klan takes over Cleveland and Akron politics, especially Akron. And in that period, water recreation sites in public parks were inaccessible to Black people. And so they actually used the valley, the Cuyahoga Valley, which sits in between the two cities, as a place of recreation to escape the Klan in Cleveland and Akron. And so the valley, what we now know to be the national park, actually was a space of Black recreation. And so here are the segregated recreation sites in Cleveland and Akron. And here is our documentation of all of the, this is a lot through oral history, all of the sites in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park that were places of Black recreation. So this is zooming in a little bit more into the 200 acres that we were hired to design, and we saw that the Drift Inn and the Cabin Club are actually just outside our boundaries. So we asked very nicely if we could also include that in our project, and we were granted that. And so this is a little bit of our research into the Drift Inn and the Cabin Club. It was an incredible place of musical performances, a lot of outdoor education, urban civic groups were bringing youth to the valley to learn about nature. So this is just continued archival kind of resources that we found. You can keep going. Picnicking, music, softball, all of this happening right here in the park. And what you start to see are instances of police raids and arson over time increasing on these sites. So this is a collection of what we found in terms of both raids and arson on those Black recreational spaces. And still, some of the institutions that had a history in the park still exist. They've still persisted. And a large part of that, as I was telling the mayor, is actually the Divine Nine. The Divine Nine had a really strong presence in recreation of the valley. And so engagement of the Divine Nine has been a big part of our work here. Of all of those Black recreational sites, they were all green the last time I showed this. The grayed out ones are all the ones that have shut down as a large part of the pressure of those raids and arson. So our first our continued foray into the design was community engagement. It's a big part of our work. So we engaged the community about a year ago. We asked them these 3 questions. If you have a free day, what do you like to do outside with your family? What do you like to do by the water? And what is your experience with this national park? And we just hung out in Cleveland and Akron and had conversations and were writing notes on these cards. This is everywhere we went in Cleveland, everywhere we went in Akron. Also engaged in a small town near our site. We hosted dinner. What did we hear? This is the range of stakeholders that we're able to engage. And so there's 150 conversations in Akron and Cleveland. When we asked what their experience with the national park was, they'd never been. They never heard of it. None. And they live right next to it. But if you have a free day, what do you like to do with your family? People are going to parks. They just don't know about this national park. When we talked to the local residents in the town nearby, they pointed us to this really magical bend in the river. The southern bend on the river is the most magical place on the site, a stunning view. The fog rolls over the river. And so we crawled out into this part of the river. You can see how close it is to the road. It's right next to the road. And so it's hard to get there, but we wanted to see this place. We found it, and it's, there's a lot of riprap. Our engineer was telling us riprap is strongest the day it goes in, and so it's, a short-term solution for a bigger problem around erosion. But we saw the potential, and we started to think about that. 1,000 people that visit the park currently also were engaged. This is a collection of their favorite experiences of the park. What do you not see on this list? There's no river, there's no water. Only about 8% of their responses mentioned the water. So when we combine them, if you go to the next slide, there's a collection of things that people want to do by the water, and we started to think that might be a way to bring all these really diverse stakeholders together. So we started to come up with a transformational new river experience. This is our kind of summary of how we understood the history. There's this river. There are a series of histories that use the river along it. That's the political boundaries, the canal, the towpath, the rail, the roads. But in the opposite direction, getting to the river, there's a different set of histories. That includes the tributaries themselves as a cross-stitch to the river, the ecological connections cross-stitching to the river, the native bounds and those sites of Black recreation are all about getting to the river. And so we started to identify a series of points of interest along the river that we could cross-stitch to as a way to kind of elevate the presence of those legacies and reconnect all people to the river. And so we started to think about this as a kind of whole new riverfront experience. So these are the cross stitches. We've been working with the National Park System to integrate this with some daylighting that they're already doing, some meadow regeneration and wetland restoration. And so you kind of see that mapped out here. In order to do this, we have to do a small little thing, which is remove a county road. Just asterisk. Oh, asterisk. So the first time we presented, we were so nervous, and the superintendent of the park system, of the park, was like, absolutely, let's do it. So all of us is moving forward. She's been, advocating within the National Park Service, but also with the county, and all of us is moving forward. And keep going. I'm gonna save us a little time. So we came back to the community a second time and shared a little bit of the updates of where our plan was going. If you go to the next slide, we asked them, and this, after sharing the proposal, how did this proposal change your experience? When we saw that, when we saw the river big like that, we knew we were onto something. This is just integrating hydrology, ecology. We also identified within that kind of a map of interpretive opportunities to talk about both the environment ecologically, but also historically and culturally. Keep going. So I'll just share a few renderings just to give you a sense of some of those things that are in the plan. This is the cross stitch. This is getting to the river, a slow experience of the river. It's not about moving along it or driving past it. It's about getting to it, everything ADA accessible to the river. At the old Drift In site, where so many musical performances used to happen, we are proposing an open air pavilion. And what you see here is, my sister's a Delta, but this is an AKA, so this is a Black story. So she was mad when she saw this. If you ever see this again, it'll actually have DST on it. But the idea there is to activate, this is not about kind of a marker, a kind of statue on a pedestal or a name with walls on it. It's about activating memory. It's about activating the uses that help us understand that history in new ways and bolster that history into the future, with the activities that used to happen here. And that is really about designing the landscape to be supportive of use, of multiple uses for multiple people. Keep going. And this is, we move the road and we now can all kind of experience that magical fog rolling over the river in the morning. Okay, I'm going to, I want to talk a little bit more about the role that community engagement plays in this process. This was a landscape plan for the Strawberry Mansion Reservoir in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This reservoir was built at a time when water infrastructure was seen as a civic amenity where people can come and experience the kind of sublime views of water infrastructure. In the 1950s and 60s, this neighborhood became kind of the Harlem of Philadelphia and an incredible amenity for this Black community. Over time, the reservoir actually got fenced, and the community no longer had access to this reservoir. In the meantime, there were emergent ecologies that were really unique to this reservoir. The Audubon and Outward Bound had often opened offices along the reservoir, and it started to open up the question around whether or how people might be able to gain access to this place once again. And so we worked on a landscape plan to do just that. We started with oral histories of the reservoir, talking to largely the elders who still remember the reservoir as an incredible community asset. We found remnants in the landscape of those histories. So we decided to make a scrapbook of people's memories of the reservoir and use that as a way to tell the story of the reservoir. This was the scrapbook. It folds out into a big poster, but folds back in to fit in your pocket. And we hit the streets. We talked to folks in the neighborhood and shared these scrapbooks. This was a street team. And we asked everybody one question. You can go to the next slide. Oh, maybe you can't. What if we could spend more time by the water? And these were their answers. They didn't want a bunch of programs. They didn't want, sports fields. They didn't want kayaking. They wanted to relax. They just wanted to sit by the water. So this was kind of our understanding of how do we connect people to this reservoir from the neighborhood. How do we connect ecologically to the larger woodlands of Fairmount Park? And how do we bring both of those, getting people here and supporting these ecologies? And that kind of led to a site framework and ultimately a landscape design. And, I'm presenting this more from the realm of talking about the community engagement, not necessarily the design. I want to share a video with you about that. This is in the context of COVID, and there have been a lot of gun violence and a lot of COVID deaths in this neighborhood. And so we wanted to activate the reservoir as a way to honor the lives that were lost. And the way we did that was we held, we called a reunion of the reservoir, but it was actually more of like a candlelight vigil in the landscape. And we gathered community members and leaders, and they used the water as a space of ritual, wrote notes to the ancestors, and we kind of have this, let me stop talking, there's a video.
As part of this process, the community came together for a reunion at the reservoir in the summer of 2021. And I began to set sunset, writing notes to the ancestors and asking the important question, what if we could spend more time by the water?
We just want to make sure that we honor and respect those who have been here for decades and who have engaged in these spaces in a certain way. It's wonderful when I'm able to bring somebody here for the first time and they'll have a big Kodak smile on their face like, wow, I never knew this was here. And then they tell me, I'm definitely coming back.
We were in Bob. We had food, and I was looking through the city.
Floating through the space of my design. Drowning me a fire inside second.
And so, in this particular context, memory is something that we performed, and the design of the landscape is designed to support the performing of memory and ritual. Go to the next slide. And then I'll close with a project close to where City now, just across the river in Beacon, New York. In the native language, the name of the river translates broadly to the river that runs both ways, with a great water constantly in motion. And in the Wappinger and Lenape tradition, they hold the following phrase really dear, which is that we're all just passing through. You know, they don't name landscape features after people. They name people after landscape features, and that is because we, as humans, we are all just passing through, but it's the landscape that persists. And so we were commissioned to design 8 acres at Dia Beacon, the southern portion. So there's the iconic Robert Irwin landscape in the north, there's the museum, and then there's 8 acres to the south. And so we wanted to couch the project again, and as you probably see, and now is important to us, couching that in history. And little known history, New York, for a period in the 18th century, had more enslaved people than the state of Georgia. A lot of that was in the Hudson River Valley. So here's kind of an account of Fishkill and Rhinebeck, Clinton, and Poughkeepsie, and the towns that were most influenced by Quakerism, that's kind of further down, had the lowest numbers of enslaved, but there were a lot of enslaved people in this region. So here's kind of a view. If I had a pointer, I would tell you that Dia Beacon is in the foreground, and this is to say that the museum is actually in the historical floodplain of the river. Oh, well, we're gonna have that. That's where it is. And so here we're looking at the site historically in 1867. The Hudson River Railroad is constructed, which creates kind of a bathtub effect. It had the railroad disconnecting the site from the floodplain and creating a kind of bathtub there. So you can kind of see that effect here. 1929, the Misco box printing plant was constructed. That is the building that now houses the museum. Some fun facts about this that I love. This is actually a set of blueprints that were used and constructed 6 different locations. The windows are sited or located such that the northern light would be the perfect kind of ambient light for evaluating the color of the printing of the boxes, which is in large part why it works really well for a museum as well. Mid-20th century, the town of Beacon, likely not so different from Newburgh. There is quite a bit of disinvestment in this period that sets the stage for the establishment of Dia Beacon in the 90s. So in the 1970s, Dia itself as an art foundation is older than Dia Beacon, but it's really formed in the context of environmental movement and kind of the idea of a counter-institution. And so they support, over that legacy, they supported a number of really notable land art works. 1986, there's a labor dispute and the plant shuts down, and it's acquired in 1998 for Dia Beacon. So Robert Irwin was the landscape architect, and this is a rendering that he made of the forecourt of Dia Beacon. And in his writing about the project, and it's also visible in the work itself, for him, the geometry that was important, or the reference, was the railroad. So if you harken back to the way we were talking about Cuyahoga, there's a history of industry that uses the river as a highway. And the railroad does that too. And Irwin wanted to use this north-south reference as the organizing framework for the landscape. And that is how you experience the museum. You move from the rail station south down into the site towards the museum. And in fact, the gallery spaces are also organized to continue that movement north to south. That movement right now stops here at the Sandback Gallery, and what you're looking at here are the 8 acres that we were commissioned to design. 2012 and 2020 were two important moments for DA Beacon. 2012 was Hurricane Sandy, which made very clear to them how vulnerable they are ecologically to this changing climate. And 2020, like for many institutions, was a moment of clarity about the work that needs to be done towards justice. And so, again, we were hired to figure that out for them. You know, it's funny, a lot of institutions, I think, know that they want to operate differently, they don't know how, and they end up hiring architects and landscape architects to help them figure that out. It's a big part of what we do now. So this is, 4 acres, almost 5 acres. Of those 8 acres is just lawn. And so we started to think about, DIA means journey. And so it's a lot of the land art, the legacy of the land art was really about movement. And so we started to think about the site in terms of movement as opposed to a static landscape. And so we wanted to draw a form. We wanted to, come up with a form based on movement. This is our analysis of how people move today. It's really in the urban north-south, setup that he designed for. That you move through the parking lot, you move through the gallery spaces, and you kind of stop. And similarly, the water on the site itself is doing a similar thing. But we're all just passing through, right? And so we wanted to think about how people and water could move through the site. We learned that, sorry, if you could go back to it. We learned that the site, because we spoke with both Black and Lenape people, and we learned that the site of DA Beacon was an important place of portage. Which, this kind of seasonal ritual of crossing the river, which was really important to the transfer of technology between people. And so we wanted to celebrate that this was a place of portage. This is one of my favorite Toni Morrison quotes, and I came back to a lot in the design process. She says, flooding, they call it flooding. Floods is the word they use, but in fact it is not flooding, it is remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. And so the designing of the landscape for water is itself a form of memorial. This is to say, I'm going to present this in 5 minutes, but it took a long time, there were a lot of iterations. But this was ultimately the sketch that we moved towards, and this is a series of sculptural landforms that orient east to west, that orient towards the Hudson River, not along it, and that retrace the movement of indigenous people towards the river. In so doing, we were able to actually, hold water on the site and make it a part of the experience of this place. Not hide the water, not act like it's not there, but actually design for the presence of an experience of water. We've also ended up reducing the lawn, converting it to over 90 species of meadow plants, working with Larry Wiener's office, who are incredible specialists in meadows, and using that to kind of enrich the experience with seasonality and texture of these landforms in the landscape. We worked with clay to really kind of calibrate both the sculptural experience of the landform, but we worked with Sherwood design engineers to calibrate that to the projections of water on the site. So this is us working with civil on that calibration of 100-year and 500-year storm events, and the way in which our design helped mitigate that flooding. So this is the drawing of movement before, and this is after, really moving people to the river. And so a lot of this was, again, about setting up a relationship of stewardship of the land, not just a design that we present and it gets built, and it's this object for preservation, but really this is a new relationship to the stewardship and management of specifically the meadow landscapes. And so Larry Wiener's office really helped make that a part of the design. We thought about the plants themselves as a kind of really diverse palette to compete with, specifically thinking about wet meadows and dry meadows. If you go to the next slide, I think. and just a kind of a really wide range of color and exuberance across the site. Some landscape by the numbers, you mentioned some of this. At one point when we shared where we were with the design process with Native people, when we shared the history, the historical analysis, they actually stopped us midway and they were like, we don't want to see another map, right? That's not how we understand history. The history of the land is in the land. You know, that we have to question who drew the maps and why. But if we actually look at the land, if you look closely at the earth, that all of the chapters of history that you described are there. And so we actually went back. This was our notation on the site of, you know, looking at, okay, the remnants of obviously the railroad, the brickyard, and all of that history is there. We just don't know how to see it, or we're not, you know, that we're not as comfortable with that being our historical analysis. And so we started to challenge ourselves to think about the materials on site and reusing them all in the construction of the site, such that the future of the site is also embedded in its history. And this is the landscape design that we ended up with. I'll end with a few renderings, although this is under construction right now, so if you go across the river, you kind of see it taking shape right now. So this is after the conversion of a lot of that meadow into the meadow landscapes. You can kind of see here the traces of the wet and dry meadows in these small micro-typographies. Topographies is the term. You can keep going. It was important for us to express to the client the range of experiences across seasons. You can keep going. How maintenance itself of the site is a spectacle to celebrate. I think winter is going to be my favorite season. This is before, and this is after. You know, this big expansive lawn is so hard to get a sense of, you know, depth of perception, and some of these folds in the landscape really help create, you know, shoulder spaces within it. So looking back at the museum, before and after. So this is atop one of those ridge lines, tracing the movement to the river and also offering prospect onto the lower basins on the other side. And this is the kind of lower wet meadows, and you can see the exuberance of these wet meadows. And it's designed to flood, right? So this idea of the presence of water actually becoming part of the experience that brings you here. This is walking along the rail line. New prospect from the gallery spaces onto these landforms. And then a connection back to the Robert Irwin Garden. So with that, I will close out, close with this phrase, which, I'll never forget, and the idea that we are all just passing through, and the idea of memory then is something that we can perform, that we share with one another, but that the landscape is here, and persists, and our role and job, and why I love landscape architecture is that we get to play roles in stewarding that landscape into something that allows us to remember. Thank you. Yeah. Actually, the question was adjacent residents, how were they engaged or how did they react to the project? Right now, the threshold between Dia Beacon's property and their property isn't very clear. And so we actually, one of the things that we have in our plan is kind of a woodland wrap that holds the Dia Beacon landscape. So I think it helps the experience from the museum's perspective, but also for residents. I think that buffering was actually something that they appreciated. So there was actually not much pushback at all. It helped clarify a relationship that wasn't that clear spatially. So it's the least of our problems. The question is, in any of our projects, is there an effort to measure, either through education, equity, the impact of our projects? I would love that, but I haven't done it myself, and that's not part of our wheelhouse necessarily, but I think it would be an important thing to do, and I hope somebody does. Yeah. How do we help the DAB client understand ecology and wildlife and the impact of it? They didn't need our convincing. They've actually, outside of the scope of our project, hired, I forget the name of the firm, but they're doing, actually that is one place where the impact of our projects is being measured. So they're out there doing wildlife counts pre-construction and post-construction. So they're going to be measuring that and tracking that. It's a big part, actually. It's a big driver for them of the project. There are a lot of hands, so I don't know where to look. Just gonna, yeah, maybe if somebody could. Oh, interpretation, role of interpretation. I think the role of interpretation is very important. We typically aren't designing that will bring somebody on, or in the case of the National Park System, they have staff dedicated to interpretation. So we see our work as an armature for interpretation. Commonly, we are not doing that ourselves, but we have that very much in the forefront of our minds as we're designing. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I think the tradition of landscape architecture relies so much on typology. A park looks like this, a plaza looks like this. I think it was something that Frank said about, it was so good. Design, the site fitting the design versus the design fitting the site. And as Olmsted's practice progresses, he actually moves towards working with the landscape as it exists versus the more heavy hand of a central park. And so the idea that we don't have a preset idea around, plaza is this, square is this, and I'm putting it in places versus what's here. And that dovetails into understanding its history. And then working with the landscape as it is to amplify what's there, restore what's there, and make the site do what it already wants to do, in that Torrington Morrison spirit of remembering. Yeah. Right. Well, I wouldn't say I was emphatic, but his writing was influential for abolitionist people. And yes, his views on slavery changed quite a bit over time. Yeah. You know, I don't want to defend him all the time, but I will say the following. You know, what he was not for, which the abolitionists were for, was that the immediate freedom of enslaved people, and he was early on, especially, more supportive of a kind of gradual, you know, freedom. And that's partly why people are hesitant to call him an abolitionist. You know, in my mind, I think there would have been benefits to, you know, the way that it actually did happen is people were immediately free, but they had no resources. The next day, there was no source of income. There was nothing. And so, I don't know if that immediately means that he's not as, you know, morally pure as an abolitionist. There may have been other reasons, and I don't want to put words in his mouth. He's a problematic figure for a lot of reasons, but I'm just offering that.